Imagine sitting inside a warm car on a freezing winter night, watching the heater melt the frost on your windshield. In the back seat, your two young boys are laughing, clutching small toy cars, completely exhausted but too excited to sleep because it is officially Christmas morning. Your home is only a short 4-kilometer drive down a familiar country road, a route you have driven hundreds of times. You turn the key, pull out into a blinding river fog, and within minutes, your entire world simply ceases to exist. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into a collection of deeply unsettling stories that prove the world is far more unpredictable than we like to admit. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in a storytelling format, you have found the right place. Please take the like button out into the freezing midnight air, promise to give it a warm winter jacket, and then leave it stranded on a deserted highway in the dark. Don't forget to check your door locks tonight, and let us get right into our first story. In late December of 1972, a 33-year-old precision machinist named Jean-Marc lived in a quiet rural valley in western France. He was a meticulous man, highly respected at the local manufacturing plant for his sharp eye and steady hands. His wife, Madeleine, was 29 years old and worked as an assistant at a village pharmacy. Together, they had built a remarkably peaceful life for their two young children, Leo, who was 7, and Julien, who was only 4 years old. The family lived in a beautiful, centuries-old stone cottage. Every weekend, he would work on the masonry or polish the exposed wooden beams, creating a perfectly safe haven for his family. They were known by everyone in their small community as a deeply affectionate, stable household. They adhered strictly to their daily routines, always showing up on time for school, work, and family gatherings, without exception. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, the cottage was filled with anticipation. Madeleine had spent the entire morning decorating a tall pine tree in the living room, hanging handmade glass ornaments and tinsel. Beneath the branches sat several beautifully wrapped parcels waiting patiently for the next morning. The plan for the evening was simple and traditional. They were invited to a nearby village for a festive dinner at the home of an old school friend named Georges. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, the family bundled up in their heavy winter coats and walked out to the driveway. Jean-Marc took great pride in his car, a deep garnet red sedan that he maintained with absolute perfection. He wiped a thin layer of frost off the windows, ushered his wife and sleepy children inside, and started the engine. The drive to the neighboring town of Cognac was short and pleasant, with holiday music playing softly on the dashboard radio as they drove past dark fields. When they arrived at the home of Georges, the atmosphere was incredibly warm and joyful. The adults shared fine wine, indulged in a lavish, multi-course French holiday feast, and talked about their dreams for the new year. The two young boys played happily on the rug with their friends' children, their laughter echoing through the brick house. As the hours ticked past midnight, the temperature outside began to plummet rapidly, casting a deep freeze over the entire valley. By 2 o'clock on Christmas morning, the party finally began to wind down. Georges walked the family out to the front porch to bid them a fond farewell. As they stepped outside, they noticed that an incredibly thick, heavy fog had rolled in off the nearby Charente River. The air was completely silent, heavy with moisture and a biting, bitter cold. Georges looked out into the darkness and felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of unease. He turned to Jean-Marc and suggested that perhaps they should stay the night sleeping on the living room sofas rather than risking the drive. Jean-Marc merely laughed and shook his head, pointing out that their own cottage was a mere 4 kilometers away, a straight drive that would take less than 10 minutes. The mist was so dense that it completely swallowed the light from his porch lamp just a few feet away. Jean-Marc switched on the headlights, but the bright beams instantly reflected off the wall of white fog, creating an eerie, blinding glare. He rolled down his window, briefly waved goodbye to Georges, and slowly shifted the car into drive. Georges watched as the garnet-red taillights crawled down his driveway, turned left onto the main road, and vanished. The drive home required Jean-Marc to navigate a narrow 2-lane asphalt road that ran directly parallel to the Charente River. On the left side of the road lay vast, flat agricultural fields that were frozen solid under the winter frost. On the right side, separated only by a thin line of wild brambles and ancient oak trees, was the river itself, its deep, dark waters moving sluggishly in the dark. Because of the fog, Jean-Marc had to drive at a crawl, keeping his eyes glued to the white lines. The next morning, Christmas Day arrived with a bright, crisp sun that quickly burned away the dense midnight mist. At around 10 o'clock, Madeline's elderly parents arrived at the stone cottage carrying a box of fresh pastries and gifts for their grandchildren. They walked up the stone pathway, expecting to hear the ecstatic shouts of the young boys tearing open their presents. Instead, as they reached the front porch, they were met with an unnatural, heavy silence that felt entirely wrong. The grandparents knocked loudly on the thick wooden door, but there was no response from inside. When they tried the handle, they found it was securely locked. Puzzled, they walked around to the side of the house and peered through the large kitchen window. On the counter, a half-empty baby bottle sat next to an open tin of coffee, looking as if someone had left them there just moments ago. Suspicion turned into a cold spike of fear when they looked toward the driveway and saw it empty. Jean-Marc's car was completely gone, and there was no sign of life. The grandparents hurried to a neighbor's house to use the telephone, frantically calling the home of Georges. When Georges answered, he was completely stunned. He confirmed that the family had left his house precisely at 2 o'clock in the morning, fully intending to drive straight home. He assured the panicked parents that Jean-Marc was an excellent driver who would never take a dangerous detour. By noon, local authorities were notified and a massive missing persons investigation was launched. The police logic was straightforward. A family of 4 inside a bright red steel automobile cannot simply vaporize on a short 4-kilometer stretch of road. The investigators immediately focused all their attention on the narrow river route. They assumed that Jean-Marc, blinded by the terrible fog, must have miscalculated a curve veered off the asphalt and plunged straight into the freezing Charente River. Dozens of officers walked shoulder to shoulder along both sides of the road, meticulously inspecting every single inch of the landscape. They were looking for the obvious physical trauma left behind by a car accident. They searched for skid marks on the road surface, broken branches in the heavy thickets, torn patches of grass, or deep ruts in the frozen mud along the riverbank. But as the hours dragged on into the evening, the searchers found absolutely nothing. The landscape was untouched. The lack of evidence was deeply baffling to the detectives. There would be shattered glass from the headlights, scraps of red paint on the tree bark, or a visible slick of dark engine oil floating on the surface of the river. Yet the frost-covered grass and wild brambles along the entire 4-kilometer route were completely pristine, with no signs of any vehicle ever leaving the asphalt. Refusing to give up the French, gendarmerie mobilized an operation. They brought in specialized naval divers who braved the zero-visibility ice-cold currents of the Charente River. The divers swam along the riverbed for days, completely blind, feeling their way through the thick mud with their hands. They utilized powerful military magnets and advanced sonar equipment, scanning every deep pocket of water where a car could potentially be hidden from view. The sonar sweeps detected several metallic anomalies along the river bottom, raising the hopes of the investigators and the weeping family members waiting on the banks. However, each time the divers hauled an object to the surface, it turned out to be nothing more than discarded farm machinery, ancient metal scraps, or old iron bed frames. The water was completely empty. The police then expanded their search perimeter, deploying helicopters to fly low over the entire region, searching the dense forests and deep ditches from above. Ground searchers mobilized hundreds of local volunteers, combed through every abandoned barn, empty warehouse, and forgotten well within a 10-mile radius. It was as if the family had driven into a black hole. As weeks turned into months, the total absence of physical clues gave rise to dark, paranoid theories within the quiet community. Whispers began to circulate that perhaps Jean-Marc had been leading a double life, orchestrating a brilliant, voluntary disappearance to escape some hidden debt or secret enemy. They found absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. Their savings account remained entirely untouched. The theory of a voluntary flight quickly crumbled under the weight of common sense. Jean-Marc and Madeleine had left behind all their winter clothes, their passports, and every single sentimental possession they owned. More importantly, no loving mother and father would meticulously decorate a Christmas tree, purchase thoughtful gifts for their children, and then abandon them to flee into the frozen night with absolutely no money leaving their elderly. Parents devastated. If it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a voluntary disappearance, the only remaining logical explanation was foul play. Investigators began to wonder if the family had been ambushed by a calculating predator waiting in the midnight fog. But this theory raised even more terrifying questions. How could a criminal intercept a moving vehicle, abduct two adults and two young children, and conceal a massive steel sedan without a single witness hearing a scream or seeing a flash of light? Years slowly bled into decades, and the stone cottage that Jean-Marc had so lovingly restored was eventually sold to strangers. The case file grew thick, with dead ends eventually being tucked away into the dusty archives of the French National Gendarmerie as one of the most haunting judicial mysteries in the nation's history. Generations of detectives retired completely broken by their inability to answer the single agonizing question of what happened on that freezing Christmas night. Today, over 50 years have passed since that garnet red sedan turned out of Georges' driveway and dissolved into the white mist. No piece of clothing, no bone fragment, and no scrap of metal has ever been recovered. The elderly parents passed away without ever knowing the fate of their children, leaving behind a legacy of unresolved grief that still haunts the quiet villages along the Charente River to this day. The most enduring and heartbreaking image of the entire tragedy belongs to the morning after they disappeared. Inside the locked, silent cottage, the festive pine tree stood green and bright in the living room, its tinsel catching the morning sun. Beneath its branches lay the wrapped toys waiting for the small hands of Leo and Julian hands that would never arrive to open them, leaving the holiday forever frozen in time. The complete evaporation of an entire family within a tiny 10-minute window remains a terrifying reminder of how easily a quiet life can be swallowed by the dark. But while a freezing river fog in western France can completely hide a massive steel automobile from the world, sometimes a crowded, neon-lit metropolis on the other side of the globe leaves behind far too much evidence packed tightly inside an ordinary cardboard box left on a busy sidewalk. And that is exactly where we are going next. In the winter of 1972, the Charente region of western France was a place of quiet beauty and ancient stone villages. In the small town of Cognac, the air was often heavy with the sweet, oaky scent of aging brandy. It was a region where families stayed for generations and where the rhythm of life was dictated by the changing seasons and the slow flow of the Charente River. For the Mechanod family, this was the only world they knew. Jacques was a 31-year-old man who worked as a precision machinist at a local factory. He was known for his steady hands and his quiet, dependable nature. His wife Pierrette was 29 and worked at a nearby pharmacy. They were the heart of their small community, raising two young boys named Eric and Bruno. Eric was 7 years old, full of energy and curiosity, while little Bruno was only 4, rarely seen without his favorite toy truck. Their home was a modest but comfortable stone house that Jacques had spent years improving. To their neighbors, the Mechanods were the picture of a happy, stable family. They were never late for work, their children were well behaved, and their garden was always perfectly maintained. As Christmas approached that year, the family was filled with the usual excitement of the season, making plans to spend the holiday with their closest and most trusted friends. On Christmas Eve, the temperature dropped significantly, and a thick, freezing fog began to roll in from the Atlantic coast. It settled over the river valley like a heavy gray blanket, reducing visibility to just a few feet. Inside their home, the family was getting ready for a festive dinner. Pierrette dressed the boys in their best wool sweaters, while Jacques went out to the driveway to warm up the engine of their distinctive garnet red family sedan. The drive to their friend's house in a neighboring village was only a few kilometers away. Despite the worsening fog, Jacques was a confident driver who knew every curve and dip in the road. They arrived at the party around 8 o'clock, greeted by the smell of roasting meat and the sound of holiday music. The evening was a joyful blur of laughter, fine wine, and children playing on the rug. It was a night of pure, uncomplicated, and warm happiness. As the clock struck 2 on Christmas morning, the party began to wind down. The two boys were fast asleep in their chairs, exhausted from the excitement. Jacques and Pierrette gathered their things, thanking their hosts for a wonderful evening. Their friend, Georges, walked them to the door and looked out at the weather. The fog had become even denser, a wall of white that seemed to swallow the light from the porch. He suggested that they all stay the night. Jacques laughed and shook his head, patting the roof of his car. He pointed out that they were only a few minutes from their own beds and he did not want to inconvenience his friends on a holiday. He promised to drive slowly and call as soon as they arrived home. He helped Pierrette into the passenger seat and carefully tucked the sleeping boys into the back with a heavy blanket. He started the engine, the red taillights glowing dimly in the freezing mist. Georges stood on his porch and watched as the car slowly backed out of his driveway. He saw the headlights cut through the fog for a few seconds before the vehicle turned onto the main road and disappeared. He stood there for a moment, listening to the fading hum of the engine until the silence of the winter night returned completely. He went back inside, closed the door, and went to bed expecting a phone call from his friend that would never come. The next morning, Christmas Day arrived with a deceptive calm. The fog had lifted, revealing a world covered in a thin layer of white frost. At around 10 o'clock, Pierrette's parents arrived at the Méchineau home, their arms full of gifts for their grandsons. They walked up the path, expecting to hear the ecstatic shouts of the young boys tearing open their presents. Instead, they found the house silent. The shutters were still closed and the driveway was empty. Thinking the family might have stayed late at the party, the parents waited for an hour. But as noon approached and there was still no sign of the garnet red sedan, they began to worry. They drove to the home of Georges, hoping to find the family still there. When Georges answered the door and told them that the Méchenauds had left at 2 o'clock in the morning, a wave of panic swept through everyone present. Something had gone terribly and inexplicably wrong. The local gendarmerie was notified immediately. Initially, the police assumed there had been a tragic accident. Given the density of the fog, it was highly likely that Jacques had lost his way and driven off the road. The most obvious danger was the Charente River, which ran parallel to the road for several kilometers. If the car had veered into the water, it could have been swept away by the cold, dark currents before anyone could see the marks or the impact. A massive search operation was launched. Hundreds of volunteers and police officers combed the 4-kilometer stretch of road between the two villages. They looked for any sign of a struggle, any broken branches, or any tire tracks leading off the asphalt. They searched the deep ditches and the thickets of trees that lined the route, but as the day ended and the sun set on Christmas, they had found absolutely nothing. No debris, no glass, and no sign of a car. The following day, specialized dive teams were brought in to search the river. The Charente was deep and the bottom was covered in thick layers of silt and mud. The divers worked in freezing conditions, moving slowly through the darkness. They used powerful sonar equipment to scan the riverbed, looking for any large metallic objects. Every time the sonar picked up a signal, the divers would descend only to find old scrap metal or discarded farm tools from years past. The lack of evidence was deeply unsettling to the investigators. If a car had crashed into the river, there should have been some physical sign of the impact. There should have been shattered glass, a torn fender, or at least a visible oil slick on the surface of the water. But the riverbanks were pristine, and the water showed no trace of a vehicle. It was as if the car and its 4 passengers had simply vanished into thin air the moment they left the driveway. As weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded. The police checked every hospital, morgue, and train station in the country. They interviewed hundreds of people looking for anyone who might have seen a red sedan on that Christmas morning. They investigated the family's finances, looking for any signs that Jacques or Pierrette had been planning to run away, but there were no secret bank accounts, no hidden debts, and absolutely no marital problems. The mystery began to take a toll on the community. People started to lock their doors and look at their neighbors with suspicion. Dark rumors began to circulate. Some suggested that the family had been intercepted by a gang of criminals. This is a common psychological reaction in small towns when the unthinkable happens. We desperately want to blame a villain because the alternative, that the world is simply random and dangerous, is often too much to bear. Every few years, the case would be reopened by a new team of detectives. They would use more advanced technology to search the river and the surrounding woods. They used ground-penetrating radar to look for buried objects and analyzed satellite imagery of the region. They even followed up on tips from psychics and amateur sleuths, but every lead ended in a dead end. The Méchenaude family remained a ghost story, a tragic puzzle with no reachable solution. In the late 1990s, a discovery was made that briefly reignited hope. A local fisherman found a piece of metal in the river that appeared to be from a car door. The police rushed to the scene and spent weeks dredging the area. They found several more pieces of scrap metal, but forensic analysis proved they belonged to an old truck that had been dumped decades earlier. The red sedan was still missing, and the 4 members of the family were still gone. The parents of Jacques and Pierrette eventually passed away, never knowing what had happened to their children and grandchildren. The stone house where the family had lived was eventually sold and renovated by new owners who had never even heard the name Mecanod. The Christmas tree that had been decorated so lovingly in 1972 was long gone, but the mystery of that night continued to hang over the village like a permanent and heavy shadow. To this day, the vanishing of the Mechanov family remains one of the most baffling cold cases in French history. It is a story that defies logic and challenges our understanding of reality. How does an entire family disappear on a 10-minute drive home? There were no witnesses, no clues, and no survivors. The Charente River continues to flow quietly through the valley, keeping its secrets buried deep within the cold, dark, and heavy mud of the ancient riverbed. Some investigators believe that the car is still there, hidden in a deep pocket of the river that has somehow been missed by every search operation. They speculate that the silt and mud have completely buried the vehicle, turning it into a steel tomb. Others believe the family was the victim of a random, violent encounter that was meticulously cleaned up. But without a body or a vehicle, these are nothing more than tragic guesses in the dark of the night. The image of those 2 young boys, Eric and Bruno, sleeping in the back seat of that red sedan as it drove into the fog, is particularly haunting. They were safe, warm, and surrounded by the love of their parents. They were looking forward to waking up and opening their Christmas presents. Instead, they drove into a mystery that would last for over 50 years. Their story is a powerful reminder of how quickly the world we know can simply and quietly fall away. Every Christmas, the people in the village still talk about the family that never came home. They look out at the river and the fog, and they wonder what truly happened on that road in 1972. It has become a part of the local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the night and the fragility of life. The names of the Mecanod family are etched into the memories of those who remember the search that yielded absolutely nothing. The finality of their disappearance is what makes it so terrifying. Usually, in cases of missing persons, there is at least a clue or a sighting, there is a breadcrumb that leads somewhere, but for Jacques Pierrette and their sons, there was nothing. They moved from the warmth of a friend's home into the absolute void. It is a void that has never been filled, a silence that has never been broken, and a tragedy that has never been truly explained. We like to believe that we live in a world where everything can be tracked and everything can be found. We have satellites, cameras, and digital footprints that follow us everywhere. But the Mechanod family reminds us that the world is much larger and more mysterious than we care to admit. It highlights a terrifying reality of the 1970s. Without the digital grid we have today, a person could truly disappear into the gaps of the physical world. As we close the file on the family from Charente, we are left with the chilling realization that some secrets are meant to stay buried. We may never know if they are resting at the bottom of a river or if they met a more sinister end in the dark. All we have are the memories of a family that was once whole and a red car that vanished into a freezing Christmas morning. It is a story of love, loss, and the eternal mystery of the human experience on this earth. The silence of that French road is a heavy weight to carry, but it is not the only place where a life can be snuffed out without a trace. While an entire family can disappear into a foggy night, other lives are taken in much more calculated ways right in the center of a crowded city. Sometimes the evidence is not hidden in a river, but placed directly in front of us, waiting for someone to notice that something is very, very wrong with the world around them. The vanishing of a family into the winter fog is a tragedy that leaves us with no answers, only a lingering sense of dread. But while some tragedies are defined by what is missing, others are defined by what is hidden in plain sight. In our next story, we travel to the northern provinces of Iraq, where a different kind of silent killer was delivered to thousands of unsuspecting families hidden inside a shipment of grain that was supposed to be their salvation. In the early 1970s, the sun-drenched plains of northern Iraq were suffering through a brutal and unforgiving drought. For generations, the farmers in Nineveh province had relied on the seasonal rains to nourish their wheat and barley crops, but the skies had remained stubbornly clear for 2 years. The earth was cracked and dry, and families who had lived off the land for centuries were beginning to face the terrifying prospect of total starvation. A man named Yusuf lived in a small, tight-knit village near the city of Mosul. He was a father of 4 and a man who took immense pride in his ability to provide for his household. By the autumn of 1971, Yusuf's grain stores were almost empty, and the ribs of his livestock were beginning to show. He spent his days looking at the horizon, praying for a miracle that would allow him to plant his fields once more and feed his hungry children. That miracle seemed to arrive in late September when a massive convoy of government trucks rumbled into the village square. The officials announced that the government had imported thousands of tons of high-quality seed grain from Mexico and the United States. This was not just ordinary grain. It was a scientifically advanced variety designed to produce a massive yield even in harsh conditions. For Yusuf and his neighbors, these trucks were a literal lifeline. As the heavy burlap sacks were unloaded, the farmers noticed something strange. When they sliced open the bags, the wheat inside was not the familiar golden color they had seen all their lives. Instead, the kernels were coated in a vibrant, almost neon shade of pink and orange. It looked more like candy or crushed jewels than something meant to grow in the dirt. Yusuf ran his hand through the pile, feeling the smooth, waxy coating of the brightly colored grain. Along with the grain came large instruction placards and labels printed on the side of every sack. However, these warnings were printed entirely in English and Spanish languages that were completely foreign to the rural farmers of northern Iraq. The officials told them the grain was for planting only, not for eating, but they did not explain why. Yusuf watched as his neighbors loaded the pink wheat onto their carts, their faces bright with a renewed sense of hope. Yusuf took his share of the grain back to his farm, but a problem quickly emerged. The planting season was still weeks away, and his family's hunger was reaching a breaking point. He looked at the pink grain and then at his youngest son, who was becoming lethargic from lack of food. In many villages, a rumor began to spread that the pink color was simply a dye used by the government to prevent the grain from being stolen or sold on the black market. The farmers were resourceful people who had spent their lives working with chemicals and fertilizers. They believed that if they could wash the pink dye away, the grain beneath would be safe to consume. Yusuf took a handful of the wheat to his well and scrubbed it vigorously with water. To his relief, the bright pink color bled away into the soil, leaving behind a kernel that looked perfectly natural. He assumed that once the color was gone, the danger was gone with it. What Yusuf and thousands of others did not know was that the pink dye was a warning indicator for a lethal neurotoxin called methylmercury. The grain had been treated with this potent fungicide to prevent rot during the long sea voyage from the Americas. While the pink dye was water-soluble and easily washed away, the mercury itself had already bonded to the organic structure of the wheat. It was invisible, odorless, and completely tasteless, hidden deep inside the grain. Yusuf and his wife began the laborious process of milling the washed grain into flour. They used a traditional stone mill, and soon the air in their small kitchen was filled with the fine dust of the harvest. His wife baked the flour into traditional flatbreads, and for the first time in months, the family sat down to a full meal. Yusuf felt a profound sense of relief as he watched his children eat. The bread was soft and had a slightly sweet aftertaste that they all enjoyed. For the next several weeks, life in the village returned to a sense of normalcy. The silent interval had begun. Methylmercury is a patient killer. It does not cause immediate stomach pain or vomiting. Instead, it slowly accumulates in the soft tissues of the body, eventually crossing the blood-brain barrier to begin its slow destruction of the central nervous system. During this time, Yusuf and his neighbors felt healthy, energized, and deeply grateful for the government's gift. The first sign that something was wrong appeared in late November. Yusuf was sitting outside his home when he noticed that his oldest daughter was stumbling as she walked toward the well. When he asked her what was wrong, she complained that her feet felt fuzzy as if they were falling asleep. Within a few days, that tingling sensation had moved to her hands and her lips. Yusuf dismissed it as a minor illness, perhaps a lingering effect of the long drought and the sudden change in diet. But the symptoms did not go away. They escalated with terrifying speed. Within a week, his daughter could no longer hold a spoon to feed herself. Her movements became jerky and uncoordinated, a condition known as ataxia. Then, the most chilling symptom emerged. She began to lose her vision. She described the world as if a thick gray fog was closing in from the edges of her eyes, slowly narrowing her field of view until she was looking through a tiny dark tunnel. Panic began to grip the village as identical symptoms appeared in almost every household. People who had been healthy just days before were now collapsing in the streets. Some became suddenly and completely blind, while others lost the ability to speak their voices, reduced to incoherent groans. Yusuf watched in horror as his youngest son lost his balance and fell into a deep, unresponsive sleep from which he could not be awakened. The miracle grain had become a curse. Local doctors were completely baffled. They had never seen an outbreak like this, and their initial diagnosis was a mass infection or a new type of plague. It wasn't until a group of victims was brought to a major hospital in Baghdad that toxicologists made the connection. When they tested the blood of the patients, the mercury levels were off the charts. The doctors realized that by washing the grain, the farmers had unwittingly removed the only warning sign while leaving the poison intact. The Iraqi government realized the scale of the catastrophe far too late. They issued an immediate order for all citizens to stop eating the pink grain and threatened the death penalty for anyone caught selling it. In a desperate attempt to hide the evidence, some farmers threw their remaining sacks of pink wheat into the Tigris River, only to have the mercury enter the aquatic food chain, poisoning the fish that other villages relied on for their survival. The hospitals across northern Iraq became scenes of absolute carnage. There were no empty beds, and patients were lined up on mats in the hallways. The sound of the wards was a haunting symphony of high-pitched screams and the rhythmic thumping of patients suffering from involuntary muscle spasms. Because there is no simple cure for mercury poisoning, once it has entered the brain, the doctors could do little more than watch as their patients withered away and died. Yusuf spent his days moving between the beds of his children, his own hands beginning to shake with the early tremors of the poison. He watched as the vibrant life he had worked so hard to protect was extinguished in a matter of weeks. The sheer scale of the tragedy was staggering. Official records later estimated that over 6,000 people were hospitalized and hundreds, perhaps thousands, died in their homes without ever being counted in the official statistics. The aftermath of the pink grain catastrophe left deep scars on the Iraqi countryside. Entire families were wiped out, and those who survived were often left with permanent brain damage, blindness, or paralysis. The international scientific community was stunned by the event, and it led to a complete overhaul of how toxic chemicals are labeled globally. It was a brutal lesson in the importance of clear, culturally appropriate communication when dealing with the lives of thousands. For Yusuf, the landscape of his home was forever changed. The fields that were supposed to be filled with the harvest were now silent, and the stone mill in his kitchen sat idle, covered in a layer of dust. He was a man who had only wanted to save his family from hunger, and in doing so, he had invited a silent, invisible killer into his home. The pink dye was gone, but the memory of that color would haunt the survivors of Nineveh for the rest of their lives. The tragedy in the plains of Iraq shows us how easily the truth can be masked by a simple lack of understanding and how hope can be weaponized against the innocent. But while a chemical toxin can be washed away from the surface of a grain, there are other types of poison that sink even deeper into the human mind. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is not what we consume, but what we are forced to believe about our own memories and our own actions. While the farmers in Iraq were fighting an invisible killer in their blood halfway across the world, in the cold, windswept landscape of Iceland, a group of young people were about to find themselves trapped in a different kind of nightmare. They were not fighting a physical poison, but a psychological one that would force them to confess to crimes that may never have even happened. In a place where the sun rarely shines, the line between reality and shadow was about to disappear. Imagine living in a place so safe that the concept of murder feels like a foreign fairy tale. In 1974, Iceland was exactly that, a tiny, isolated island where the police did not even carry guns and doors were left wide open. But But in January of that year, a young man named Gudmundur left a dance hall in a small fishing village and began a long walk home through a dark, jagged lava field. He never arrived, and despite a massive search, he was simply gone. 10 months later, another man named Geirfinnur went to a harbor cafe after receiving a mysterious phone call. He walked out of the cafe, climbed into his car, and vanished just as completely as Gudmundur. These were two separate men in two separate towns with no apparent connection. But in a country with almost no crime, the public and the government began to panic. They demanded answers, and the police, who had no experience with such cases, felt the immense pressure. The investigation eventually focused on a group of 6 young people who lived on the fringes of society. They were counterculture types, seen as misfits in the conservative Icelandic culture of the time. One of them was a 20-year-old woman named Erla. She was arrested for a minor embezzlement charge, but during the interrogation, the police showed her a photograph of the missing Gudmundur. They asked her if she had seen him. Erla said no, but the police did not stop. They kept her in a small, windowless cell in total solitary confinement. For days, then weeks, she was denied contact with anyone but her interrogators. She was subjected to intense sleep deprivation and told over and over that she had been involved in a dark, violent event she had simply forgotten. This is where a terrifying psychological phenomenon called memory distrust syndrome begins to take hold, where a person starts to doubt their own sanity under extreme pressure. The police were not just asking questions, they were providing the answers they wanted to hear. They suggested scenarios, described weapons, and drew maps of locations. Erla began to have strange visions that felt like memories. She eventually signed a statement saying she and her friends had murdered the missing men. Her friends, including her boyfriend Sævar, were subjected to even harsher treatment. Sævar was held in solitary for over 600 days, a record in modern times. During his time in the hole, Sævar was drugged, beaten, and kept in a state of constant disorientation. He was forced to reenact a murder he could not remember, using a dummy in a lava field while police shouted instructions at him. Eventually, his mind broke. He, like the others, began to believe that he was a killer. He remembered the smell of the blood and the sound of the bodies being moved, even though no bodies were ever found and there was zero physical evidence. It is worth noting that the human brain is remarkably plastic under trauma. When the state removes all sensory input and replaces it with a single aggressive narrative, the brain will often adopt that narrative just to survive the isolation. In this case, the Icelandic police were being advised by a hardline West German investigator who specialized in forceful interrogation. This created a perfect storm of coercion that essentially rewrote the life stories of 6 innocent people. All 6 suspects were convicted and sent to prison based entirely on their own fabricated confessions. They spent years behind bars, carrying the weight of crimes they did not commit, but worse, they lived with the internal horror of believing they were monsters. It was not until decades later, in 2018, that the Supreme Court of Iceland finally acquitted them. Forensic psychologists proved that their confessions were the result of torture and mental manipulation. The tragedy of the Reykjavik confessions is that the 2 original men who disappeared were never found. Most modern investigators believe they died of natural causes or accidents in the harsh Icelandic wilderness, which is notoriously dangerous for those on foot at night. The police, in their desperation to solve a mystery, created a much larger and more sinister one. They did not find the truth. They manufactured a nightmare that destroyed the lives of 6 young Icelanders. The final image of this case is Sævar, long after his release, still walking through the streets of Reykjavik with a folder of papers trying to prove his innocence to anyone who would listen. He died before he was officially exonerated. The silence of the Icelandic lava fields remains a cold reminder of the men who were lost and the memories that were stolen by the very system meant to protect them. It is a story about the absolute and terrifying fragility of the human life. While the cold winds of Iceland could break a person's mind through isolation and silence, the heat of a bustling city like Sydney, Australia, offered a different kind of danger. There, the threat did not come from the police trying to manufacture the truth, but from a powerful alliance of criminals and corrupt officials who wanted to bury it forever. And just like the men in the lava fields, one woman was about to walk into a building and simply disappear from the map of the world. In the mid-1970s, the district of King's Cross in Sydney, Australia, was a place that never truly slept. It was a neon-soaked labyrinth of nightclubs, gambling dens, and jazz bars where the smell of expensive perfume mingled with the grit of the urban. At the center of this swirling chaos was a woman who seemed to belong to an entirely different world, an heiress and fashion icon named Juanita Nielsen. Juanita was the granddaughter of a wealthy retail giant, but she chose to live a life far removed from the safe confines of high society. She was a tall, striking woman with a signature beehive hairstyle and a wardrobe that turned heads whenever she walked down the street. However, beneath her polished exterior was a fierce, independent spirit and a deep sense of justice for the working-class people who called the Cross their home. She owned and published a local alternative newspaper called Now, which she ran from her beautiful terrace house on Victoria Street. The paper was her weapon, and she used it to document the vibrant culture of her neighborhood. But by 1974, the tone of her publication began to shift. A massive redevelopment project was threatening to demolish the historic homes of Victoria Street to make way for high-rise luxury apartments. Juanita saw this as an act of corporate war against the residents. She watched as elderly tenants were harassed and physically intimidated by thugs hired to clear the buildings. Instead of staying silent, she used her newspaper to name the powerful developers and expose the criminal muscle they used to do their dirty work. She became the public face of the resistance, standing on the front lines of every protest in the city. One of her most effective moves was convincing the local builders union to place a green ban on the project. This meant that no union worker would step foot on the site as long as the residents were being threatened. It was a brilliant strategy that ground a multi-million-dollar project to a complete halt. But in doing so, Juanita had placed a massive target on her back, interfering with the profits of some very dangerous people. As 1975 began, the atmosphere around Victoria Street grew increasingly dark and heavy. Juanita started receiving anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night filled with heavy breathing and silent threats. Men in dark suits were seen idling in cars outside her home, watching her every move. Her friends begged her to leave the city for a while, but Juanita refused to be intimidated by what she called schoolyard bullies. On the morning of July 4th, 1975, Juanita was preparing for a business meeting. A man named Edward Trigg, who worked at the Carousel Club, had contacted her about placing an advertisement in her newspaper. The Carousel Club was a notorious venue owned by a prominent crime figure with deep ties to the developers. Even though the meeting seemed suspicious, Juanita saw it as an opportunity to gain information. She spent the morning at her desk typing out notes for her next editorial. She dressed in a stylish checkered suit, pinned her hair into its perfect signature style, and grabbed her handbag. Around 10:30 in the morning, she walked out of her front door and headed toward the heart of King's Cross. It was a short walk, a route she had taken 1,000 times past the cafes and the bustling morning crowds of the Neon District. When she arrived at the Carousel Club, the heavy iron doors were closed to the public as it was still early in the day. She knocked, and witnesses later recalled seeing a man open the door to let her inside. The interior of the club was a windowless world of red velvet, stale cigarette smoke, and shadows. Juanita stepped into the foyer, the door clicking shut behind her, and from that exact moment, she simply ceased to exist. Hours passed, and the sun began to set over Sydney Harbor, but Juanita did not return to her office to finish her work. Her business manager, who was used to her punctuality, began to feel a cold knot of anxiety. He checked the local bars and called her close friends, but no one had seen the striking woman with the beehive hair since the morning. By nightfall, the realization set in that something catastrophic had occurred. The initial police response was strangely slow and dismissive, which was a common occurrence in the corrupt landscape of Sydney law enforcement at the time. They suggested that perhaps she had just taken a spontaneous holiday or was hiding out to gain publicity for her cause. But those who knew Juanita knew she would never leave her newspaper unattended or her pet dogs without food. She was a woman of habit and deep responsibility. The investigation only gained momentum when her handbag was discovered days later dumped near a freeway miles away from the city center. Inside were her personal effects, but her notebook, the one she used to record her investigations into the developers, was missing. The discovery of the bag confirmed everyone's worst fears. Juanita hadn't left on her own accord. She had been taken by force from the very heart of the city. As the police finally began to look into the Carousel Club, they were met with a wall of silence. The staff claimed that Juanita had arrived for the meeting, but that it had been canceled at the last minute. They insisted she had walked back out the front door and disappeared into the crowd on the street. However, there were no witnesses on the busy sidewalk who remembered seeing her leave, which was impossible given her height and fame. Detectives eventually uncovered a massive web of corruption linking the crime syndicates of King's Cross to high-ranking government officials and police officers. It appeared that the developers had used their connections to ensure that Juanita was silenced permanently. The Carousel Club was not just a nightclub, it was a hub for the organized crime figures who were losing millions of dollars because of Juanita's green bands. Despite several inquests and a massive public outcry, no body was ever found. The theories of what happened to her in the basement of that club are the stuff of urban nightmares. Some believe she was incinerated in a local furnace, while others suggest she was buried in the foundations of the very buildings she was trying to save. The lack of a body meant that the prime suspects could never be charged with her murder. The erasure of Juanita Nielsen remains the most infamous cold case in Australian history. She was a woman who had everything, yet she risked it all to protect the humble homes of her neighbors. Her disappearance effectively ended the green bans and allowed the developers to move forward, but her story turned her into a martyr. The buildings on Victoria Street still stand today, a haunting monument to a woman who refused to back down. The final image of Juanita is one of defiance. She is remembered not as a victim, but as the elegant lady of the cross who stood her ground against a tide of greed and corruption. Her face still stares out from murals and posters in the district, a reminder that the truth cannot be buried forever, even if the person who spoke it is gone. She was a bright light in a very dark corner of the world, extinguished far too soon. The silence of the Carousel Club is a chilling testament to how powerful people can make a human being vanish in broad daylight. But while one woman was silenced by the shadows of a city, an entire nation was about to be brought to its knees by an invisible enemy that arrived from across the sea. In the next story, we travel to Yugoslavia, where a simple act of religious devotion would accidentally unleash a medieval plague. The year was 1972, and the citizens of Yugoslavia were living through an era of rapid growth and modernization. They believed they were safe from the diseases of the past, but they were about to learn that the smallest interaction can have the most devastating consequences. An invisible war was about to begin in the crowded marketplaces and hospital wards, where a single handshake could seal the fate of thousands. In the early spring of 1972, a 35-year-old man named Ibrahim Hoti returned to his small, dusty village in the Kosovo region of Yugoslavia. He had just completed the Hajj, the long and sacred religious pilgrimage, to the holy city of Mecca. Ibrahim was now a man of high standing, greeted as a hero by his neighbors. He brought back stories of far-off lands, small gifts for his family, and a sense of profound spiritual fulfillment. Ibrahim felt a little tired after his long journey by bus and train, and he had a slight headache that he attributed to the dry heat and the dust of the Middle East. He also noticed a few small red spots on his chest, but they did not itch or hurt. To him, it was just a minor irritation, a small price to pay for the journey of a lifetime. He went about his daily life, visiting the crowded marketplaces in the town of Djokovica to share his blessings with his friends. The marketplace was the heart of the community, a place where hundreds of people gathered to trade livestock, vegetables, and news. Ibrahim was a social man, shaking hands with dozens of acquaintances and sharing pieces of bread. He did not know that with every breath and every greeting, he was shedding an invisible medieval killer. The virus, known as variola major, was quietly leaping from his skin into the lungs of everyone he touched in the cool morning air. For 2 weeks, absolutely nothing happened. This was the silent countdown of the smallpox virus. It is an airborne predator that colonizes the respiratory tract before migrating to the lymph nodes. In the case of Ibrahim, because he had been vaccinated as a child, his immune system kept the symptoms mild. He survived without even realizing he was truly sick. But The people he met in that market had no such protection, and their bodies were about to become battlefields. One of those people was a young schoolteacher named Latif Mumzik. Latif was 29 years old, athletic, and well-liked by all of his students. He had only shared a brief conversation with Ibrahim near a textile stall, but that was enough. A few days later, while standing at the front of his classroom, Latif was hit by a sudden bone-shaking chill. He felt as if his blood was turning to ice, and a violent fever sent him home to bed in a state of total collapse. Latif's family watched in horror as he spiraled into a waking nightmare. His skin became hypersensitive to the point where even the touch of a light bedsheet felt like burning coals. Massive dark bruises began to bloom under his skin, a terrifying sign of internal hemorrhaging. He was rushed to a local clinic where the doctors, having never seen smallpox in their professional lives, assumed he was having a catastrophic allergic reaction to a dose of penicillin. They transferred Latif to a larger hospital in the city of Kakak, and then finally to the highly prestigious dermatovenerology clinic in Belgrade. By the time he arrived in the capital, he was barely recognizable. He was suffering from what is known as blackpox, the most lethal form of the disease, where the skin does not even form pustules because the patient bleeds to death internally first. He died in a crowded ward surrounded by dozens of unsuspecting doctors. It was not until Latif was already in the morgue that the realization finally struck. A senior doctor noticed the specific mottled pattern of the hemorrhaging and felt a cold spike of dread. He ordered an immediate secret test of the tissue samples. When the results came back, the word variola echoed through the halls of the hospital like a death sentence. The invisible enemy was no longer hidden. It was already deep inside the heart of the Yugoslavian capital. The government of President Josip Broz Tito reacted with the brutal efficiency of a socialist military state. They did not just issue warnings, they declared a state of total emergency. Overnight, the borders of the country were slammed shut. Entire hotels and apartment buildings where cases were suspected were surrounded by soldiers with fixed bayonets. No one was allowed in, and more importantly, no one was allowed out. A terrifying silent war had begun. The challenge was the scale of the contact tracing. Latif had traveled through several cities by bus while he was highly contagious. The authorities had to track down every single person who had been on those buses, every person in the waiting rooms, and every student in his class. They turned schools into quarantine centers and sports arenas into massive vaccination hubs. The goal was to vaccinate every single citizen of Yugoslavia, all 18 million of them. For the average citizen, life became a surreal blur of fear and needles. Military trucks rumbled through the streets of Belgrade and Sarajevo, broadcasting orders via loudspeakers. People stood in lines that stretched for miles, waiting in the cold to receive the scratch of the bifurcated needle. There was no room for debate or refusal. If you were found on the street without a vaccination certificate, you were forcibly taken to a clinic and processed by the army. Inside the quarantine zones, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of disinfectant and death. Families were separated with the sick, taken to isolated wards where nurses worked in heavy rubber suits that made them look like deep-sea divers. Because smallpox is so highly infectious, the bodies of the deceased could not be returned to their families for traditional burials. They were placed in zinc-lined coffins and buried in unmarked pits under the cover of night. The outbreak lasted for less than 2 months, but it left a scar on the national psyche that never fully healed. In total, 175 people were infected, and 35 of them died. It was the last major smallpox outbreak on European soil, a final bloody gasp from a disease that had haunted humanity for thousands of years. By May of 1972, the military cordons were finally lifted, and the streets were declared safe once again. Ibrahim Hoti, the man who had inadvertently started it all, survived his mild case without any lasting damage. He lived the rest of his life with the knowledge that his pilgrimage, an act of pure religious devotion, had resulted in a national catastrophe. He was never prosecuted as the government realized he had no way of knowing he was carrying the virus. He became a ghost in his own village, a man whose very presence reminded people of the terror of the black pox. The smallpox outbreak in Yugoslavia was a victory for public health, but it was achieved through the total suspension of civil liberties. It showed that when faced with an invisible ancient killer, the modern world is only a few handshakes away from total collapse. The images of the soldiers guarding the hospital gates and the endless lines of people waiting for their needles remain a haunting reminder of our vulnerability to the microscopic world around us. Today, the virus that caused such terror is officially extinct in the wild, stored only in high-security laboratories. But for those who lived through the spring of 1972, the fear of a simple cough or a stranger's handshake never truly went away. It was a time when the world stood still, and the only thing that mattered was the invisible line between the healthy and the infected. The silence of the quarantine zones still echoes in the old wards of Belgrade. While the citizens of Yugoslavia fought a war against a biological predator they could not see, others were engaged in a much more personal and quiet battle with their own identities. Some people spend their lives trying to escape the shadow of a single world-shaking event. For one woman in Japan, the struggle to disappear was not about a virus, but about a crime of passion so famous that even after decades of silence, she could never truly be forgotten by the public. In the quiet hallways of a hotel in Chiba, an elderly maid was about to perform her final act of self-erasure. She had spent a lifetime running from a past that the rest of the world refused to let go of. Just like a virus that hides in the body before it strikes her, true identity was a secret that could only be kept for so long. But in the end, her disappearance would leave behind a note that would haunt the people who found it long after she had vanished into the mist. The medical context, smallpox or variola vera, had a mortality rate of 30%. The Yugoslavian outbreak is often cited as one of the most successful, albeit aggressive, examples of epidemic containment in history. A haunting legacy. The schoolteacher, Latif Mumjic, is remembered as the primary catalyst for the outbreak's spread, yet he was also a victim of a healthcare system that was fundamentally unprepared for a disease it believed was already conquered. The complete lockdown of a nation is a powerful display of state control used to fight an enemy that cannot be reasoned with. But sometimes, the most effective way to disappear is not through a government-mandated quarantine, but through a personal choice to step out of the light and into the shadows. In our next story, we look at the final days of a woman whose name once dominated the headlines of an entire country, only for her to end her journey with a single sentence. In the early months of 1971, the manager of a quiet, unassuming hotel in Chiba Prefecture, Japan, noticed something unusual about one of his most reliable employees. She was an elderly woman in her mid-60s who had been working as a maid for several months. She was exceptionally quiet and possessed a formal politeness that seemed to belong to an older era. She never spoke of her past, her family, or where she had come from before arriving at the coastal hotel. The other staff members knew her only by a simple alias. She moved through the hallways like a ghost, cleaning rooms with a mechanical precision that suggested she was trying to make herself as invisible as possible. There was a profound sadness in her eyes, a heavy weight that seemed to pull at her shoulders whenever she thought no one was looking. Despite the bustling environment of the hotel, she lived in a state of total isolation, eating her meals alone and avoiding questions. What no one in that hotel realized was that they were working alongside a woman who had once been the most infamous figure in all of Japan. Decades earlier, in 1936, her name had dominated every newspaper in the country. She had been the center of a sensationalized and dark crime of passion involving a wealthy lover named Kichizo. The details of that event were so shocking that they became a permanent part of Japanese folklore, a dark obsession for the public. After serving her prison sentence, the woman had been released into a world that viewed her as a monster or a tragic curiosity. She spent years drifting from city to city, changing her name, and taking menial jobs in the hospitality industry to survive. Every time someone seemed to recognize her or ask too many questions about her youth, she would pack her bags and vanish overnight. She was engaged in a desperate, lifelong race against her own identity, trying to find a place of peace. By 1971, the exhaustion of this constant flight seemed to have finally caught up with her. The manager noticed that she had stopped taking her meals altogether and would spend her breaks staring out at the gray waters of the Pacific Ocean. She appeared to be settling her affairs, moving with a strange, calm purpose that unsettled the few people who interacted with her. She was no longer running from the past, she seemed to be waiting for a natural conclusion. The hotel in Chiba was a place of transit where people came and went without forming lasting bonds. This suited her perfectly. She spent her days scrubbing floors and changing linens, performing the most humble tasks with a level of care that bordered on the religious. To her, the work was a form of penance, a way to keep her hands busy so her mind would not drift back to the blood-stained room in Tokyo where her life had essentially ended 35 years before. Her room was a tiny cell in the employee wing, containing nothing more than a thin futon, a small wooden desk, and a single window overlooking the parking lot. She owned almost nothing. While other women her age were enjoying their grandchildren or participating in village festivals, she sat in the dark listening to the hum of the hotel's industrial heaters. She had effectively removed herself from the flow of time, living as a relic of a scandal that the world refused to bury. On a chilly morning in early January, the maid did not show up for her shift. This was a complete violation of her perfect record, and the manager immediately went to her small employee room to check on her. He knocked on the door several times, calling her name, but there was only a heavy silence from within. He used his master key to open the door, expecting to find the woman ill or perhaps even deceased. Instead, he found a room that was chillingly empty and organized. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets pulled tight without a single wrinkle. Her few personal belongings, which usually sat on the small wooden dresser, were gone. There was no sign of a struggle and no evidence of a hurried departure. It looked as if no one had ever lived there at all. The only object remaining in the entire room was a tiny folded scrap of paper sitting exactly in the center of the desk. The manager picked it up and read the few words written in a delicate script. The note did not offer an explanation for where she had gone or what she intended to do. It contained only one heartbreaking sentence that seemed to summarize her entire existence since 1936. It read simply, "I am just a no-use girl." By the time the manager reported the disappearance to the local police, the woman was long gone. When investigators eventually cross-referenced her alias, they realized with a shock that they had lost the legendary Sada Abe. The police launched a missing persons search, checking the nearby cliffs and the train stations, but Sada Abe had perfected the art of self-erasure over 35 years of hiding. No one had seen an elderly woman boarding a bus or walking toward the sea. There were no sightings in other cities, and no body was ever recovered. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the mist of the Japanese coastline, completing the journey she had started decades before when her life broke. In the days following her disappearance, the media caught wind of the story, and once again, the name Sada Abe was splashed across the headlines. Reporters descended on the quiet hotel in Chiba, interviewing the confused manager and the terrified staff. They searched for any clue she might have left behind, any hint of where a woman of her notoriety would go to finally find rest. But Sada had left them with nothing but that single haunting sentence on a scrap of paper. Historians and psychologists have debated the meaning of her final note for decades. To some, it was a statement of ultimate defeat, a realization that she could never escape the shadow of her crime. To others, it was a final act of defiance, a way to tell the world that she was no longer the scandalous figure they craved, but just an old woman who had outlived her purpose. She had spent her life as a symbol, and in the end, she chose to become a ghost instead. The search eventually cooled, and the file on the disappearance of the maid from Chiba was moved to the cold case archives. In Japan, there is a tradition of people who choose to vanish, known as the Johatsu, or the evaporated people. They leave their lives behind to start over in the shadows, and Sada Abe became perhaps the most famous example of this phenomenon. She didn't just leave a building, she exited the collective consciousness of a nation that was obsessed with her. The hotel manager eventually moved on to another job, but he never forgot the quiet woman who cleaned the rooms. He often wondered if he had walked past her in a crowded market, or seen her sitting on a park bench in another city, her face hidden behind a surgical mask or a simple headscarf. He realized that for someone like Sada, being invisible was the only form of freedom left. She had found a way to die while she was still breathing a feat of incredible will. The final note of Sada Abe remains a haunting epilogue to a life defined by a single dark moment of passion. She did not want fame, and she did not want forgiveness. She only wanted to be forgotten. Her disappearance in 1971 was her final success, a quiet victory over the public that had spent decades trying to claim her story for themselves. She left the world on her own terms, leaving behind a silence that was far more powerful than any of the headlines. One of the most chilling aspects of her story is the absolute lack of closure. Usually, when a person vanishes, there is a trail of breadcrumbs, a sighting on a camera, or a record of a bank transaction. But Sada Abe lived in a world of cash and paper, a world where a person could truly disappear if they had the discipline to remain silent. She proved that the past only has power over you if you stay in one place long enough for it to catch up to you. As the years passed, the legend of Sada Abe grew, but the woman herself remained a phantom. Some believe she lived out her days in a remote temple, while others suspect she ended her life in the Aokigahara forest. But the truth is likely much simpler and much more lonely. She likely lived as she had in Chiba, as a quiet shadow in the corner of a room, working until her hands could no longer move, finally finding the anonymity she had craved for over 30 years. There is a specific kind of horror in the idea of a life spent entirely in hiding, of a person who is forced to treat their own name like a curse. Sada Abe's journey from a lover in Tokyo to a maid in Chiba is a testament to the weight of public infamy. She was a woman who was haunted by her younger self, pursued by a ghost that looked exactly like her. Her disappearance was the only way to finally lay that ghost to rest, even if it meant leaving everything behind. The silence of that hotel room in Chiba is a reminder that we never truly know the people who move through the periphery of our lives. The person cleaning your room or serving your coffee might be carrying a secret that would stop your heart. Sada Abe walked among the living for decades, a living monument to a forgotten era, until she decided that the play was finally over. She took her final bow in total darkness, and the curtain has stayed down ever since. The disappearance of Sada Abe marked the end of an era in Japanese true crime, shifting the focus from the sensational to the psychological. It left a void that could never be filled, a mystery that remains as potent today as it was in 1971. She is a reminder that some stories do not have a tidy ending and some people are not meant to be found. She remains the girl who was no use to a world that wanted too much from her. The quiet disappearance of an elderly woman in Japan shows how some people will go to any length to escape a world that watches them too closely. But while Sada Abe chose to walk away from the light and into the shadows, others were just beginning their journey into the unknown. On a rainy night in the United Kingdom, a young teacher was about to step onto the side of a modern motorway, looking for a ride that would lead her into a mystery that would haunt the police. The M1 motorway was a symbol of progress, a concrete artery cutting through the heart of England, but for Barbara Mayo, it would become a path into a nightmare. She was a woman with a bright future, a dedicated teacher who believed in the kindness of strangers. But in the autumn of 1970, the roads were not as safe as they seemed, and the person who stopped to pick her up was not looking to help. She was about to become a different kind of ghost. Historical context: Sada Abe's crime in 1936 involved the strangulation of her lover, Kichizo Ishida, and the subsequent severing of his genitals, which she carried with her for days. Her story has inspired countless films, books, and plays in Japan. The aftermath. Despite being a high-profile case, the Chiba police were never able to find a single lead after her disappearance in 1971. She was officially declared dead in absentia years later, though no evidence of her fate ever emerged. The final note, left in a quiet hotel room, is a chilling testament to a life spent running from the light. But while some vanish by choice, others are taken by force, leaving behind a trail of evidence that stretches for miles along a lonely highway. In our next story, we look at the largest police inquiry in British history, triggered by a young woman who simply wanted to get home, only to find herself trapped in a web of transit and terror. Imagine the year 1970. The M1 motorway in England was the newest, fastest artery in the country, a concrete river that promised to connect the cold north to the bustling south in just a few hours. Back then, the road felt like a symbol of freedom. It was a time when standing on the rain-slicked shoulder with your thumb out was not seen as a dangerous gamble, but as a standard way for a young person to see the world on a budget. Barbara Mayo was a 24-year-old trainee teacher who embodied that sense of independence. She was brilliant, deeply kind, and had a smile that could light up a room. She lived in London with her fiancé, and their life together was just beginning. On a cold, overcast Monday in October, Barbara needed to get to Yorkshire to pick up a car her father had bought for her. She decided that instead of taking the train, she would hitchhike north along the M1. She dressed warmly in a long coat and boots, kissed her fiancé goodbye, and set off with a small bag and a sense of purpose. For several hours, things went perfectly. Witnesses saw her at various service stations along the motorway, looking cheerful and safe. She was moving efficiently through the gray autumn gloom, getting rides from businessmen and families. By late afternoon, she reached a point where the landscape becomes more rugged and the woods grow thick. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the rain started to fall more heavily, turning the asphalt into a dark, reflective mirror. Barbara stood near an exit ramp, her thumb out, illuminated intermittently by the yellow glare of passing headlamps. To the thousands of drivers streaming past at 70 miles per hour, she was just a momentary silhouette in the rain. But to one person, she was a target. A car slowed down, pulled onto the shoulder, and Barbara climbed inside. From that moment on, Barbara Mayo effectively vanished from the map. When she did not arrive in Yorkshire that evening, her family initially assumed she had been delayed by the weather or had decided to stay with a friend along the way. But by Tuesday morning, when the phone remained silent, a cold, sharp dread began to settle into the hearts of her loved ones. Barbara was exceptionally responsible. She would never simply fail to call if she were safe. The police were notified. 6 days later, the mystery took a horrific turn. A man out walking his dog near a wooded area called Hardwick Hall, just a few hundred yards from a motorway junction, noticed something unusual in the thick undergrowth. He pushed through the wet leaves and found Barbara. She was lying in a shallow depression in the earth, her body partially covered by debris. She had been raped and strangled with a length of thin twine, a tool often used by laborers or gardeners. The discovery sent a shockwave through the United Kingdom. This was not just a murder, it was an assault on the very idea of modern travel. The M1 was supposed to be a place of speed and progress, not a hunting ground for a predator. The Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire police launched what would become the largest criminal inquiry in British history up to that point. They were determined to find the man who had turned a routine journey into a nightmare of violence. The logistical challenge facing the detectives was staggering. On any given day, tens of thousands of vehicles traveled along that stretch of the M1. The killer could have come from anywhere, like London, Manchester, or Leeds, and could have been back home having dinner with his family before Barbara's body was even cold. He was a ghost who had used the anonymity of the highway network to his advantage, blending into a stream of traffic that never stopped to look back. Detectives began the painstaking process of interviewing every single driver who had used the motorway on that Monday afternoon. They set up checkpoints, stopping thousands of cars to ask if anyone remembered seeing a young woman in a long coat. They took over 125,000 statements and checked over 50,000 vehicles. It was a forensic mountain of data, but in an era before computers, the investigation relied on paper files and human memory. Several promising leads emerged. A witness recalled seeing a white car, possibly a Morris 1000 or a Ford Zephyr, parked on the hard shoulder near where Barbara's body was found. Inside, a man was seen talking to a young woman who matched Barbara's description. The police issued a national appeal for the driver of that car to come forward, but the owner never appeared. The white car, like its driver, seemed to have evaporated into the damp English air. Forensic teams examined the twine used in the murder, hoping it might lead them to a specific factory or trade. They analyzed soil samples from Barbara's clothing, trying to map her final movements through the woods. But the physical evidence was frustratingly sparse. The rain had washed away many potential clues, and the killer had been careful not to leave behind any fingerprints or personal items. He had struck with a calculated efficiency that left the experts baffled. As the months turned into years, the Barbara Mayo case became a dark legend in the annals of British crime. It changed the way an entire generation looked at hitchhiking. The carefree culture of the 60s was replaced by a new sharp caution. Parents stopped letting their children travel alone, and the hard shoulders of the motorways became lonely, silent places after dark. The killer had not just taken one life, he had stolen a sense of national security and trust. To this day, the identity of the man who picked up Barbara Mayo remains unknown. Over the decades, several infamous serial killers have been suggested as suspects, but no definitive link has ever been proven through modern DNA testing. The killer remains an anonymous face in a crowd, a man who likely lived out his life in total normalcy while carrying the secret of that rainy night in October of 1970. He simply vanished into the speed of the road. The image of Barbara standing in the rain, hopeful and trusting, is a haunting reminder of a lost era. She was a woman who believed in the inherent goodness of the people around her, and she paid the ultimate price for that belief. Her story is a tragedy of the modern age, where the very infrastructure designed to bring us together can also provide the perfect cover for a monster. The M1 continues to hum with traffic, but the shadow of 1970 still lingers in the trees. The silence of the Hardwick Hall Woods is a heavy weight, a place where a bright future was extinguished in an instant. But while some killers use the vastness of a highway to hide their crimes, others find that the most effective way to strike is from within the absolute safety of a home. We move now from the rain-slicked roads of England to a quiet farmhouse in rural Ontario, Canada, where a young mother's life was taken by a single muffled gunshot. In December of 1974, the tiny community of Raglan, Ontario was the kind of place where people did not just know their neighbors, they knew their neighbors' grandparents. It was a rural, quiet stretch of land where the sound of a passing tractor was often the most exciting event of the day. For 22-year-old Beverly Lynn Smith, the quiet was a comfort. She lived in a modest farmhouse with her husband and their 10-month-old daughter. It was a freezing Monday night, and the snow was beginning to pile up against the wooden siding of the house. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The kitchen was warm, filled with the smell of dinner simmering on the stove. Beverly was moving between the counter and the sink, preparing a meal for her husband, who was out for the evening. In the bedroom just down the hall, her infant girl was fast asleep in her crib. The house was illuminated by the soft glow of the kitchen light, a beacon of domestic peace in the vast, dark Ontario countryside. Beverly was a gentle, devoted mother whose entire world revolved around that 10-month-old baby. As she reached for a wooden spoon to stir the pot, the only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint crackle of a distant radio station. She felt completely safe, cocooned in the familiarity of her own home. At some point during that evening, a figure approached the farmhouse. There were no barking dogs to give warning, and no sound of tires on the gravel driveway. The back door, which like most doors in Raglan was left unlocked, was open quietly. Someone stepped into the warmth of the kitchen. Beverly likely did not even have time to turn around before the intruder raised a weapon. A single muffled gunshot rang out, shattering the silence of the farmhouse forever. Beverly Lynn Smith fell to the floor instantly. She had been shot in the back of the head at point-blank range, an execution-style killing that was as efficient as it was brutal. The intruder did not linger. They did not search for money, they did not touch the sleeping baby, and they left no physical evidence behind. They simply stepped back out into the freezing December night, leaving a young mother dead on her kitchen floor while her dinner continued to simmer. When Beverly's husband returned home later that night, he found the house strangely quiet. He walked into the kitchen and was met with a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His wife was gone, and his daughter was crying in the next room, having finally woken up to the silence of a house without a mother. He frantically called the police, but the investigation that followed would prove to be one of the most frustrating and baffling in Canadian history. Detectives from the Durham Regional Police swarmed the property, but they found absolutely nothing. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, and most importantly, no clear motive. Beverly had no enemies. She was not involved in drugs, she had no secret lovers, and her family had no wealth to steal. The killing felt completely random, yet it was carried out with the cold precision of a professional hit. The town of Raglan was paralyzed by a deep, shivering fear. Neighbors began to look at each other with suspicion, wondering which one of them could be a monster. One individual who frequently came up in conversations was a man named Alan Smith, no relation to Beverly, who lived just down the road. Alan was a friend of the family and had been in the house many times. Police questioned him, but without a weapon or a witness, they had no choice but to let him go. The case slowly went cold, gathering dust for over 30 years. In the late 2000s, a specialized cold case unit decided to take one final aggressive shot at solving the murder. They decided to use a controversial and elaborate tactic known as a Mr. Big operation. This is a high-stakes psychological game where undercover officers pose as members of a powerful criminal organization. They recruit a suspect, offering them money and prestige, slowly drawing them into a fake world of crime to gain their absolute trust. The target of this operation was Alan Smith. Over several months, undercover agents befriended Alan, taking him on luxury trips and paying him for small illegal favors. They created a sense of brotherhood, making Alan feel like he was finally part of something big. The goal was to lead him to the boss of the organization, a man known as Mr. Big. In order to join the upper ranks, Alan was told he had to share a secret, something dark that proved his loyalty. Under the immense pressure to impress his new criminal family and fearing that his past might be a liability, Alan Smith finally began to talk. During a recorded meeting in a hotel room, he described that night in 1974. He told the agents that he had gone to the farmhouse to see Beverly and that in a moment of sudden impulse, he had shot her. He provided details that seemed to match the crime scene, and the police finally felt they had their man. Alan Smith was arrested and charged with first-degree murder based entirely on this confession. It seemed like a triumph for the cold case unit, a decades-old injustice finally being corrected. But when the case went to trial, the victory began to crumble. Alan's lawyers argued that the confession was entirely fabricated. They claimed that Alan, a lonely man with a history of mental health struggles, had simply told the agents what they wanted to hear to keep his new friends. The judge in the case, Justice Bruce Glass, took a hard look at the tactics used by the police. He noted that the Mr. Big operation had exerted an overwhelming amount of psychological coercion on a vulnerable man. The details Alan provided in his confession were inconsistent, and some of them actually contradicted the original forensic evidence from 1974. The judge ruled that the confession was unreliable and had been extracted through extreme manipulation. In a stunning conclusion, Alan Smith was acquitted of all charges. The judge stated that the police had effectively written a script for a murder and forced a man to play the lead role. The courtroom was silent as the realization set in the case was back at zero. Beverly's family was left devastated once again, their hopes for closure shattered by a botched and overly aggressive investigation. The execution at the kitchen counter remained an unsolved mystery. Today, the farmhouse in Raglan still stands a quiet witness to a night of absolute horror. The cold December air still whistles through the trees, and the memory of Beverly Lynn Smith continues to linger in the minds of those who remember her. She was a mother whose life was stolen in the most intimate of places, and the person who pulled the trigger has never faced justice. Her story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the truth is lost in the shadows. The execution of a mother in her own kitchen is a tragedy that proves even the most peaceful sanctuary can be breached by darkness. But while one killer remained hidden in the silence of a rural town, other tragedies occur on a much grander scale, where the silence is not a choice but a catastrophic failure of design. We leave the lonely farmhouse in Canada and move toward a different kind of horror, one that would fall directly out of the sky over France. In 1974, the aviation world believed it had reached a pinnacle of safety and engineering. But for the 346 people on board Turkish Airlines Flight 981, that belief was about to be shattered. A massive wide-body jet was climbing over the lush Ermenonville forest when a single overlooked mechanical flaw turned a routine flight into a plunge toward the Earth. The forest was about to become the site of a silent corporate tragedy. Legal nuance. The Mr. Big tactic is unique to Canada and a few other jurisdictions. Its use in the Beverly Lynn Smith case led to a landmark ruling by the Supreme Court of Canada that significantly restricted how these operations can be conducted, emphasizing the high risk of false confessions when suspects are financially or psychologically vulnerable to the undercover team. Forensic reality. The lack of forced entry in the 1974 crime scene strongly suggested the killer was someone Beverly knew or someone she did not perceive as a threat, which is why the investigation focused so heavily on neighbors and local acquaintances for decades. The single gunshot in Raglan left an infant crying in the dark, a small sound in a very large and quiet world. But the sounds that would soon echo through the Ermenonville forest were deafening the roar of a massive engine and the scream of a structure failing at 30,000 feet. In our next story, we look at the moment a cargo door became a death sentence and how a known flaw was allowed to stay hidden until it was far, far too late for everyone on board. In the early 1970s, a new giant ruled the skies. It was the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, a three-engine wide-body jet that represented the absolute cutting edge of aerospace engineering. To the public, these planes were flying cathedrals, silent and powerful, promised to make international travel safer than driving to the grocery store. But inside the blueprints of this massive flying Katini, overlooked detail was waiting to fail. On a bright Sunday afternoon in March of 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 sat on the tarmac at Orly Airport in Paris. The plane was heading for London, and it was nearly at full capacity. Because of a strike at a different airline, hundreds of additional travelers had been rerouted onto this specific flight, filling the cabin with 346 men, women, and children from all over the world. Among the passengers was a group of young athletic men from an amateur British rugby team returning home after a match in France. They were laughing and sharing stories of the game, their voices filling the rear of the cabin. Scattered throughout the other rows were families going on holiday and businessmen clutching their briefcases. None of them had any reason to believe that their lives now rested on a single latch in the belly of the aircraft. Outside on the ramp, a baggage handler named Mohammed was finishing his shift. He closed the large rear cargo door, pushed the locking handle down, and saw that the external indicator appeared to be in the correct position. He did not speak English or Turkish, so he could not read the warning plate nearby, but the handle seemed secure. He stepped away, giving the signal for the ground crew to push the massive jet back from the terminal gate. The DC-10 roared down the runway and climbed gracefully into the clear blue sky over France. Captain Najat Berkoz was an experienced pilot who loved the smooth handling of the new widebody. As the plane reached 12,000 feet, the passengers began to unbuckle their seatbelts and relax. The flight attendants moved through the aisles preparing to serve drinks. Everything about the journey felt routine, safe, and entirely ordinary. At precisely 12:41 in the afternoon, a sound like a heavy artillery shell echoed through the cabin. A massive explosion originated from the rear of the plane as the cargo door suddenly burst outward. The difference in pressure between the cabin and the thin outside air was so violent that it created a localized hurricane inside the fuselage. 2 rows of seats were instantly sucked out through the hole into the freezing void below. But the missing door was only the beginning of the nightmare. When the cargo hold decompressed, the air pressure above the cabin floor remained high, causing the entire floor to buckle and collapse downward. In a catastrophic design oversight, the engineers had run all the primary flight control cables through the floor. As the structure gave way, the steel cables were severed or jammed, leaving the pilots with no way to move the wings or the tail. In the cockpit, Captain Berkoz and his co-pilot felt the control column go completely limp in their hands. They were fighting a ghost ship. The engines were still roaring, but the plane had entered a steep, high-speed dive that they could not stop. They pulled back on the sticks with all their strength, but the aircraft did not respond. The nose continued to drop, and the ground began to rush toward them at over 500 miles per hour. Below them lay the Ermenonville forest, a lush and ancient stretch of woodland just north of Paris. It was a beautiful spring day, and the canopy of trees looked soft and green from the air. But as the massive jet plummeted toward the earth, the forest became a wall of wood and stone. The passengers in the cabin had less than 70 seconds from the moment of the explosion to the moment of impact. The silence of the dive was deafening. Turkish Airlines Flight 981 struck the trees at such a high velocity that the aircraft disintegrated instantly. There was no fire and no chance of survival for anyone on board. It was at the time the deadliest single-plane crash in history. When rescuers finally reached the scene, they found a path of destruction through the forest that stretched for hundreds of yards, but the debris was so pulverized that it was difficult to identify. Investigators from the French and American authorities soon arrived to pick through the wreckage. They were searching for a reason why a brand new aircraft would simply fall out of the sky. Deep in the mud of the forest floor, they found the rear cargo door. When they examined the latching mechanism, they discovered a terrifying truth. The door appeared to be locked from the outside, but the internal pins had never actually engaged. It was a mechanical lie. The real horror emerged during the legal discovery process. It turned out that the manufacturer had known about this specific flaw for years. 2 years earlier, an American DC-10 had suffered an identical cargo door failure over Windsor, Ontario. In that case, the pilot had managed to land the plane safely, and a scathing internal memo had been written warning that the door would eventually kill a full load of passengers unless the design was changed. Despite this urgent warning, the corporate leadership chose to implement a superficial fix rather than a complete redesign, which would have been expensive and caused delays in production. They gambled that a small metal plate and an inspection window would be enough to prevent a disaster. They were wrong. Their hubris and focus on the bottom line had turned a modern marvel into a flying trap for 346 unsuspecting souls. The aftermath of the Ermenonville crash completely changed the way the world looks at aviation safety. It forced a total overhaul of the relationship between manufacturers and regulators, ensuring that known flaws could never be hidden again for the sake of profit. But for the families of the British rugby players and the hundreds of others who perished in the forest, the lesson came at a price that can never be truly calculated or forgiven. Today, a small stone memorial stands in a quiet clearing in the Ermenonville forest. The trees have grown back, and the sound of birdsong has replaced the roar of the engines. But if you walk deep into the woods, you can still feel the weight of what happened there on that Sunday in 1974. It is a place where the air feels heavy with the memory of a routine journey that ended in a heartbeat because of a single silent blind spot. The tragedy over France was born from the cold, calculated decisions of a boardroom where people were treated as numbers on a ledger. But sometimes the darkness does not come from a corporate office. It comes from a single, predatory mind waiting at the edge of a sidewalk. We move now to the sun-drenched streets of Genoa, Italy, where a young girl's walk home would be cut short by a man in a very distinct red suit driving a very distinct red car. In 1971, the city of Genoa, Italy, was a labyrinth of ancient marble palaces and grit-stained industrial ports. It was a place where old money lived in high villas, looking down at the working class below. Arturo Sutter was the king of this world, a titan whose wax and cleaning products were in every Italian home. His 13-year-old daughter, Melena, was the center of his universe, a girl known for her athletic grace and sharp mind. Every morning, Melena would leave the family villa, a sprawling estate that felt more like a fortress of success than a house. She was a dedicated student at the Swiss school, an elite institution tucked away on a quiet street called Via Peschiera. Melena was not the typical wealthy heiress. She was described as grounded, deeply responsible, and possessed of a maturity that made her seem much older than 13. Her routine was like clockwork, a series of safe and predictable movements. On the afternoon of May 6th, the spring sun was warm over the Mediterranean. At exactly 5 o'clock, the school bell echoed through the hallways, signaling the end of the day. Melena gathered her leather satchel, adjusted her school uniform, and walked out into the bright afternoon air. She was in a hurry because she had a private history lesson scheduled at home. She gave a quick wave to her classmates and headed toward the sidewalk, unaware that she was being watched. For several days leading up to this moment, a specific and vibrant detail had been out of place near the school gates. A sleek, garnet-red Alfa Romeo Spider had been seen idling at the curb. The car was a beautiful, expensive machine that stood out among the duller vehicles of the city. Behind the wheel sat a man in his mid-20s wearing a tailored red suit that matched the color of his car. He didn't look like a kidnapper. He looked like a man who belonged in a fashion magazine. As Melena reached the corner, she was seen by a few witnesses approaching the red sports car. There was no struggle, no shouting, and no sign of fear. It appeared as though she recognized the driver or was simply curious about the man in the distinct suit. She leaned toward the window, a brief conversation took place, and then she climbed into the passenger seat. The engine roared to life, and the red Alfa Romeo merged into the heavy flow of Genoese traffic, disappearing into the city. Back at the Sutter Villa, the domestic staff was preparing for the evening. The table was set for dinner, and the house was filled with the rhythmic ticking of antique clocks. By 6 o'clock, Arturo Sutter began to check his watch. His daughter was never late, especially not for her beloved history lessons. He looked out the window at the long driveway, expecting to see her walking up the path, but the driveway remained empty, and a cold, silent dread began to seep into the room. The parents began a frantic series of phone calls, reaching out to teachers and Melena's closest friends. No one had seen her since she left the school gates. The police were notified, but in the 1970s, Italian authorities often waited 48 hours before declaring a child missing. Arturo, however, knew his daughter better than anyone. He knew that Melena wouldn't just vanish. That night, the family sat in the living room, staring at the silent telephone, waiting for a sign. The silence was shattered at 9 o'clock the following morning. The telephone rang, and Arturo snatched the receiver. A calm, low voice on the other end spoke in Italian, delivering a message that confirmed their worst fears. The voice demanded 50 million lire for the safe return of Melena. The caller was brief and disciplined, hanging up before the police could even begin to trace the signal. The Sutter family was now officially trapped in a high-stakes kidnapping for ransom. The news of the Sutter kidnapping hit the Italian media like a tidal wave. Because Arturo was such a prominent figure, the newspapers became obsessed with the case. They sent reporters to the school, the villa, and every corner of Genoa. It was during this media frenzy that the witnesses from the school began to speak about the man in the red suit. The press quickly gave him a haunting nickname that would follow him for decades: the Blonde of the Red Spider. Detectives focused all their resources on finding that car. They searched every garage and parking lot in the province, eventually narrowing their list to a young man named Lorenzo Bozzano. Lorenzo was a 25-year-old drifter from a respectable family, but he was known as a black sheep. He owned a red Alfa Romeo Spider and was often seen wearing flamboyant, colorful suits. He was a man who lived a double life, balancing a high society name with a dark and impulsive nature. When police first questioned Lorenzo, he was incredibly calm, almost arrogant. He admitted to being near the school, but claimed he was simply admiring the architecture. He had a solid alibi for the time of the ransom calls, and with no physical evidence linking him to Melena, the police were forced to let him go. Arturo Sutter watched from his villa as the prime suspect walked free. For 2 weeks, the investigation stalled and the ransom demands stopped coming. The trail went cold. On the afternoon of May 20th, the mystery took a horrific turn. Two friends were out on a small fishing boat near the coast of Perugia, just a few miles from the city center. The water was remarkably clear that day. As they looked down into the blue depths, they saw a dark shape floating just beneath the surface. At first, they thought it was a discarded mannequin or a large piece of driftwood. But as they pulled closer, they saw a shock of hair and a school uniform. The fishermen contacted the harbor police, and divers were sent down to recover the body. What they found was a scene of calculated cruelty. The body of a young girl had been weighted down with a heavy lead diving belt, the kind used by professional skin divers. The belt was strapped tightly around her waist to ensure she would never rise to the surface. When they brought her to the docks, Arturo Sutter had to perform the most agonizing task of his life. He confirmed it was Melena. The autopsy revealed a chilling truth. Melena had been killed within an hour of her disappearance on May 6th. She had been strangled with such force that her neck was broken. This meant that every ransom call Arturo had answered was a lie. The killer had murdered her instantly and then spent the next several days trying to extort money from a grieving father. The city of Genoa was consumed by a collective rage, and the police moved immediately to arrest Lorenzo Bozzano again. This time, they didn't just ask questions, they tore Lorenzo's life apart. In his hotel room, they found a notebook filled with disturbing plans. He had written out transit times from the Swiss school to various isolated locations. Even more damning forensic experts analyzed the lead diving belt found on Melena's body. They traced the specific brand and model to a dive shop where Lorenzo was a regular customer. He had bought that exact belt just days before the kidnapping. The forensic investigation moved to Lorenzo's red Alfa Romeo. Using the emerging science of trace evidence, detectives vacuumed the interior of the car and the wheel wells. They found microscopic soil samples that matched the specific mineral composition of the beach where Melena's body was likely prepared for disposal. They also found small fabric threads on the car's upholstery that were identical to the wool used in Melena's school sweater. The circumstantial web was closing. The trial of Lorenzo Bazzano became a national spectacle in Italy. He was the perfect villain for the media, a wealthy, arrogant youth who had targeted a younger, innocent girl from his own social class. Lorenzo denied everything, claiming the soil and the threads were all coincidences. In a shocking first verdict, the court actually acquitted him due to a lack of direct eyewitnesses. The public was outraged, and the Sutter family felt as though their daughter had been killed twice. However, the Italian legal system allowed for an appeal. In 1975, a higher court reviewed the forensic evidence and the bizarre kidnapping plans found in Lorenzo's room. They ruled that the sheer volume of circumstantial evidence made his guilt a mathematical certainty. The acquittal was overturned, and Lorenzo Bazzano was sentenced to life in prison. He fled the country for a short time, but was eventually captured and sent to serve his sentence in Porto Azzurro. For over 40 years, Lorenzo Bazzano remained behind bars, never once admitting to the crime. He spent his days writing letters to the press, still claiming to be the victim of a conspiracy. He died in 2021 while on a temporary release for health reasons. With his death, the final chapter of the Melena Sutter case was closed, but the questions remained. Why would a man with so much potential choose to destroy a young life for a sum of money he didn't even need? The image of the red Alfa Romeo Spider remains a ghost in the history of Genoa. It is a symbol of a time when the city lost its sense of security. Arturo Sutter continued to run his empire, but the light had gone out of his life on that afternoon in May. He kept Melena's room exactly as it was the day she left for school, a frozen monument to a 13-year-old girl who just wanted to get home for her history lesson. The red suit and the red car are gone, but the shadow stays. The death of Melena Sutter shows how a single distinct detail can lead the police to the truth, even when a killer tries to hide his tracks in the depths of the sea. But while a red sports car is easy to spot in the sunlight, other dangers are much harder to see. Sometimes the threat isn't a person at all, but a machine that begins to act on its own, driven by a ghost who has already left the world behind. The tunnels beneath London were about to prove that silence is the loudest warning. We move now to the final story of this collection, back to the heart of the United Kingdom in 1975. It was a normal morning on the London Underground, a world of rhythmic steel and morning coffee. But at the Moorgate station, the rhythm was about to break. A veteran driver was sitting in his cab, staring straight ahead into the darkness as his train accelerated toward a solid brick wall. This was not a mechanical failure, but a mystery that would defy every doctor in England. The complete evaporation of a family in France and the forensic threads of a murder in Italy all lead us to this final subterranean nightmare. It is a story of a man who became a passenger in his own life and a tragedy that left investigators with no one to blame. As the train enters the tunnel, the lights begin to flicker, and the passengers have no idea that the man at the controls has already checked out. This is the story of the Moorgate ghost at the throttle, and it starts right now. Imagine you are standing on a subway platform during the morning rush hour. The air is thick with the scent of ozone and damp wool coats. You hear the distant, rhythmic rumble of an approaching train, a sound so familiar it has become part of the city's heartbeat. You check your watch, adjust your bag, and wait for the screech of the brakes. But this morning, the screech never comes. Instead, there is only the roar of an engine that refuses to die. On February 28, 1975, the London Underground was a world of absolute predictability. For the hundreds of commuters on the Northern City Line, the journey into the heart of the financial district was a mindless ritual. They read their newspapers, sipped lukewarm tea from thermoses, and leaned against the rattling windows. It was a cold, gray Friday morning, and everyone was simply looking forward to the weekend. The man at the controls of train number 273 was Leslie Newson. At 56 years old, Leslie was the embodiment of reliability. He had been a motorman for decades, a veteran who knew every inch of the tunnels by touch and sound. He was a quiet, disciplined man with a perfect safety record. That morning, he had even brought a small bag of fresh sugar to work for the office tea, a mundane detail that spoke of his normalcy. Leslie's shift started like any other. He was cheerful, chatting briefly with his colleagues about his plans for the evening. He was going to buy a used car for his daughter, and he had over 200 pounds in cash tucked neatly into his jacket pocket. There was no sign of stress, no health complaints, and certainly no indication of a troubled mind. To everyone who saw him that morning, Leslie Newson was a man completely at peace with his world. At 8:38 in the morning, the train pulled away from Old Street Station, heading toward its final stop, Moorgate. The tunnel between these two stations is short, a straight shot of dark steel and concrete. As the train gathered speed, the passengers in the front carriages began to stand up, gathering their coats and umbrellas. They knew the timing of the journey by heart. They expected the train to begin its deceleration any second now. Inside the driver's cab, something was happening that defied every rule of the railway. As the train approached the Moorgate platform, it was traveling at approximately 35 miles per hour. This is the point where a driver must apply the brakes to bring the heavy steel cars to a gentle halt. But Leslie Newson did not move his hand. He did not touch the brake lever. He simply sat in his seat, staring straight ahead into the lights of the station. Passengers standing on the Moorgate platform looked up in confusion as the train roared into view. They expected the usual slowing of the cars, but instead, they saw the train accelerating. It was a terrifying sight. The massive front of the lead carriage flew past the waiting crowds, a blur of silver and glass. Some people began to scream, realizing that the train was not going to stop. It was heading directly for the solid brick wall at the end of the tunnel. A young man in the second carriage looked through the connecting window into the driver's cab as they sped past the platform. He later testified to a detail that would haunt the investigation for years. He saw Leslie Newson sitting bolt upright, his hands firmly on the controls. Leslie was not slumped over the wheel, nor was he struggling. He was looking straight ahead through the windshield, his face completely expressionless, as if he were driving into a ghost station. At the end of the Moorgate tunnel, there was a safety device called a sand drag designed to slow down runaway trains. But at 35 miles per hour, the sand drag was useless. The train hit the sand, skipped over it, and slammed into the solid concrete and brick buffer at the end of the line. The force of the impact was so immense that the first three carriages were crushed together like an accordion collapsing from 65 feet in length down to just 15. The sound of the crash was a deafening metallic roar that shook the entire station. Then there was a silence so heavy it felt physical. Thick clouds of black dust and soot filled the tunnel, making it impossible to see or breathe. Deep inside the wreckage, 43 people had been killed instantly. Dozens more were trapped in the mangled steel of the first carriage, which had been driven upward into the roof of the tunnel by the sheer momentum of the cars behind it. The rescue operation at Moorgate would become the most difficult in the history of the London Underground. Emergency crews had to work in a space no larger than a crawl space, surrounded by jagged metal and the smell of leaking hydraulic fluid. The temperature in the tunnel rose to over 100 degrees as the heat from the hundreds of trapped bodies and the rescue equipment became unbearable. It took 4 days of constant, agonizing work just to reach the driver's cab. When the recovery teams finally cut through to Leslie Newson, they expected to find a medical explanation for the disaster. They looked for signs of a massive heart attack, a stroke, or perhaps a brain aneurysm that had paralyzed him before. But as the medical examiners performed the autopsy, they were met with a baffling news. Leslie Newson's heart was healthy. His brain showed no signs of trauma or disease. He had not been under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Investigators looked into every corner of Leslie, searching for a motive for suicide. They interviewed his family, his friends, and his doctor. They found a man who was happy, financially stable, and free. There was no suicide note, no history of depression, and no reason to take the lives of 40 people. Even the deadman's candle and safety device that should have stopped the train if the driver let go had been held down by Leslie until he could land. One of the most chilling theories suggested that Leslie had suffered from a rare condition called transient global amnesia, a sudden loss of memory and memory. But even then, he should have reacted to the lights of the station or the screaming of crowd. Instead, he remained a conscious ghost at the throttle, staring into a void that only he could see. He didn't just fail to brake, he seemed to have chosen to drive into the wall with total silent intent. To this day, the Moorgate disaster remains the greatest mystery of the London Underground. It is a tragedy without a culprit and a crime without a motive. The brick wall at the end of the tunnel was eventually replaced with a more modern safety system, but the shadow of 1975 still lingers in the station. Commuters still glance toward the dark end of the platform, wondering about the man who sat upright and silent as he led 43 souls into the dark. The final image of the Moorgate crash is not the mangled steel or the dust, but the small bag of sugar found in Leslie's personal bag. It was a simple, sweet gesture for his coworkers, a symbol of a man who expected to finish his shift and go home. That bag of sugar sitting in the darkness of the wreckage is a haunting reminder of how thin the line is between a normal day and an inexplicable nightmare. Sometimes the ghost in the machine is the machine itself. The silence of the Moorgate Tunnel is a heavy subterranean weight, a place where 43 lives were ended by a mystery that science cannot touch. It is the final stop on our journey through the strange, dark, and mysterious events of the early 1970s. Each of these stories, from the foggy rivers of France to the neon streets of Italy, reminds us that the world we believe we understand is often just a thin veil pulled over a vast and deep ocean. But while a train can disappear into a brick wall in the heart of London, other stories remind us that the most terrifying things aren't always found in the dark. Sometimes they are found in the choices we make when we think no one is watching. As you walk out of the station tonight and into the cool evening air, remember to look twice at the familiar things around you. The world is full of ghosts, and some of them are still holding onto the controls, waiting for the end of the line. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks is a comfort until it stops, and the lights of the city are a guide until they flicker and fade into the mist. We have traveled across continents and through the decades, uncovering the threads of tragedies that still vibrate in the present day. These 12 stories are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of the unknown. The archives are deep and the shadows are long, but the truth is always there. The evaporation of a family, the poison in the grain, and the ghost at the throttle are all parts of a larger map, a geography of the unexplained that we have only begun to explore together. As the echoes of the 1970s fade into the distance, we are left with the chilling realization that the most dangerous mysteries are the ones that have no answer. The doors are locked, the lights are low, and the story of the strange, dark, and mysterious continues on. As we look back at the trail of evidence left behind in these 12 accounts, we see a pattern of lives interrupted by forces beyond their control. Whether it is a corporate oversight in a forest or a forensic thread in a cardboard box, the truth has a way of surfacing when we least expect it. But for some, the surface is a place they will never reach again, remaining forever as part of the landscape of the lost, waiting for a voice to tell their story. The journey doesn't end here, because the world is a vast place, with many more corners where the light doesn't reach. Every city has its secrets, and every highway has its shadows, and I will be there to find them and bring them back to you. Until then, stay observant, keep your senses sharp, and never assume that the path you are on is as safe as it looks. The ghost at the throttle is just one of many who are still out there in the dark. But while the subterranean tunnels of London hold their secrets tight, the open ocean and the high peaks of the world offer no more safety to those who dare to cross them. Sometimes the most peaceful locations on Earth are merely waiting for the right moment to reveal the darkness that has been hiding just beneath the surface for generations. In our next collection, we will step away from the concrete of the city and into the raw, unforgiving beauty of the wild. The next 12 stories will take us to places where the maps are blank and the only law is survival. We will look into the eyes of those who faced the impossible and lived to tell the tale, and those who vanished into the wind without a single trace. The strange, dark, and mysterious is not confined to the past. It is a living, breathing part of our world, and we are just getting started. So, until next time, make sure you check your locks. We have just traveled through a long journey into the shadows of the 1970s, a decade where the world seemed to be shifting between the old and the modern. These 12 stories are not just isolated cases or accidents, they are pieces of a larger puzzle illustrating the sheer fragility of life. As we sit here together by the flickering light of these tales, we must look deeper into what actually happened behind those dusty, decades-old headlines in the dark. The common thread in all these tragedies is the betrayal of the most ordinary things. A warm Christmas Eve, a morning commute on a subway, or even a freshly baked loaf of bread. We often delude ourselves into thinking that safety is the default state of life, but in reality, that security is merely a thin layer of paint covering an unpredictable chaos. These 12 stories have stripped that paint away in the most brutal and haunting manner imaginable in this endless night. Consider the case of the Melena family in France or the disappearance of Sada Abe in Japan. These are prime examples of the absolute silence of the void. In the case of the Melena family, their vanishing feels like a glitch in the matrix of reality itself. A ton of steel and 4 human beings cannot simply evaporate. It reminds us that no matter how far science advances, the world still holds black holes that human reason can never truly touch or understand in this dark world. The disappearance of Sada Abe carries a different tone, one of active self-erasure. The lesson here is about the price of dark infamy and the crushing weight of the past. Some people spend their entire lives running from their own names, and sometimes the only way to find freedom is to become a ghost in broad daylight. It raises a deep philosophical question: do we truly exist if no one knows who we are? Anonymity can be a blessing, but it can also be a life sentence for the soul. Next, we must discuss the danger of blind faith in systems as seen in the pink grain catastrophe in Iraq or the DC-10 crash in France. These are expensive lessons about institutional negligence and corporate greed. When grain sacks carrying the pink hue of death are handed to illiterate farmers, or when a cargo door design flaw is ignored for profit, we see the true face of indifference. It is a colorless, odorless poison that commits mass murder while we are all sleeping. In these cases, knowledge and transparency are not just information, they are survival weapons. The failure of language in Iraq and the suppression of truth by an American aviation giant turned innocent people into scapegoats for progress and profit. The lesson is that we must never stop questioning the entities that hold power over our lives. A healthy level of skepticism is sometimes the only thing standing between us and a heartbreaking tragedy that could have been avoided. Another deeply disturbing theme is the breaking of the human mind exemplified by the case in Iceland. 6 young people confessed to crimes they never committed simply because they were convinced their own memories were false. This is a warning about the terrifying power of psychological manipulation and the gaps in the justice system. When authorities are too desperate for an answer, they may accidentally or intentionally create a fake truth, and the price is human freedom. Memory is a fragile thing, and under the pressure of isolation and mental torture, it can be completely rewritten. This story teaches us that justice is not just about finding the guilty, but about protecting objective truth from the imposition of political will. The confessions at Reykjavik are a long scar in legal history, reminding us that a system based on coercion will always create imaginary monsters instead of bringing true peace to the society we live in every day. We also cannot ignore the predators hiding in the flow of modern society, like the killer on the M1 motorway or the man in the red suit in Italy. These stories highlight the extreme fragility of trust between strangers. Barbara Mayo placed her faith in the kindness of people she didn't know, only to meet a tragic end. It reflects a painful cultural shift where the personal freedom of the 60s was strangled by the rise of anonymous violence lurking out there tonight. The Melena Sutter case in Italy brings a lesson about the sharpness of early forensic science. Using soil threads and microscopic traces to convict Lorenzo Bazzano was a massive leap forward, but it also showed the horror of a calculating predator. A killer is not always a hideous monster. Sometimes it is a handsome young man in an expensive sports car. Evil often hides beneath a shell of luxury and the most polite gestures, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The disappearance of Juanita Nielsen in Australia and the execution of Beverly Lynn Smith in Canada reveal another side internal rot and buried conspiracies. In Juanita's case, we see the unholy alliance between organized crime and economic power. When an individual dares to stand against a massive tide of money, they often become a target for erasure. The lesson is that courage has a very high price, and sometimes the truth is buried under the concrete foundations of progress. The case in Canada with the Mr. Big operation shows the thin line between law enforcement and systematic deception. Posing as criminals to trap a suspect for decades reveals a desperation for justice, but when methods become too extreme, justice itself is wounded. The lesson is that the end can never justify every means, especially when those means can bend the truth and destroy an innocent life. It is a reminder that the path to the truth must be as clean as the truth itself. The smallpox outbreak in Yugoslavia offers a perspective on human helplessness against biological predators. In an increasingly connected world, a simple pilgrimage can become the start of a national catastrophe. The lesson about sacrificing privacy for communal safety in emergencies remains relevant today. It shows that sometimes iron discipline and medical transparency are the only things that can prevent total annihilation when an invisible enemy is knocking at the door. Finally, the accident at Moorgate Station is a reminder of the absolute mystery of the human mind. There are moments that we simply cannot explain with biology or mechanics. An experienced driver, completely sober, chooses to drive into a brick wall without even blinking. It teaches us that we never truly know what is happening inside the head of the person sitting right next to us. There are silences in the human soul that no camera or machine can ever hope to reach. Looking back at all 12 stories, we see an invisible thread connecting them all, the search for meaning in chaos. Each tragedy is a warning, a landmark for us to recalibrate how we perceive the world around us. We learn that we must pay attention to the smallest details because sometimes a single thread or a strange color is the only boundary between life and death. Vigilance is not fear. It is a form of deep respect for the life we are given to live. The true value of these stories does not lie in the horror or curiosity, but in how they force us to face the reality that life is a series of choices and coincidences. Each person we studied had a normal morning before everything changed forever. This reminds every listener to cherish moments of peace and never ignore unusual signs, no matter how small in your environment. Pay attention to the things that seem just a little bit off in your world right now. We analyze these cases not to live in anxiety, but to build a stronger survival instinct. From corporate rot to killers on the highway, the greatest lesson is solidarity and compassion. When society cares for the vulnerable, like the girl in Hong Kong or the farmers in Iraq, we create a stronger safety net. Darkness can only thrive when we choose to look away from the pain of others. Compassion is the light that keeps the predators of the world at a safe distance in the dark. As we conclude this journey, I want you to take a deep breath and look around your room. The walls, the locked doors, and the electric light are things we often take for granted. But through these 12 stories, we know that the world outside still contains things that cannot be explained and potential hazards. Always keep a sharp mind, a warm heart, and eyes that know how to observe, because those are the best tools you have to lead yourself through the darkness. I hope these analyses and lessons from these 12 stories have brought you a deeper insight into human nature and society. We don't just recount the past for entertainment, but to light small candles in the night of unsolved mysteries. Remember that every story leaves an aftershock, and what we learn from those aftershocks will decide how we face the future. I wish you a peaceful night, and may you always be kept safe from the things that go bump in the dark. The stories of these 12 lives have now become a part of your memory. Do not let them vanish like the fog on the Charente River or the ghost at Moorgate Station. Turn them into living lessons to protect yourself and those you love. This world is full of strange, dark, and mysterious things, but as long as we never stop searching for the truth, the light will always find a way. Thank you for walking with me through this haunting journey into the shadows tonight.